So welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to another preview of the upcoming patch, and this is a matchup which is quite similar to the one that I showed previously, because once again it is going to be the Elves taking on Erebor, only this time it's going to be Imladris, and this is going to be interesting simply because of the four Elven factions, Imladris is certainly the one that is more geared towards going for a straight up confrontation, if you will. They are certainly the ones with the most heavy-duty infantry. They have, on average, the highest armour values of all of the elves. And you might think that that plays into the dwarves' hands quite a bit, but ultimately the archer focus of Mirkwood didn't really help them in the last battle. They were still able to get a lot of damage done, obviously, with their ranged units, in particular their javelins in the late game, but it may well behoove the elves to take a more infantry-heavy approach to try and deal with the dwarves, because the skill of the elves can overcome quite a lot of the dwarven lower tiers in particular. But we'll go through the army compositions, and we'll start off with Imladris being played by Crimson Behalit, and he's got some Imladris sentries here in the middle, previously known as the Imladris Guards, because I think he's got 2 units of them. So again, a pretty good choice, honestly, simply because Erebor do not have the archers to deal with these guys at long range. Obviously, high tier pikes like this are always going to be archer bait, you're always going to be taking a lot of fire with them. But of course, Erebor only have crossbows as their ranged contingent, so they will still be the target of the crossbows, I think, as the battle goes along. However, the crossbows may well struggle to get a decent angle on them, and if the Imladris sentries get set up, the dwarves are going to find it very difficult to break through the elven centre, so this is a pretty nice centre to the line. I think we've only got 1 unit of Eldar Makar, which is interesting. Usually the more affordable nature of this sort of basic elven unit means that you often see more than just one of them. And they are a very good mainline unit. Every time I've played Imladris so far, these guys have not let me down once. Even when I've lost as Imladris, it hasn't been the fault of the Eldar Makar. Definitely one of my favourite mainline infantry units in the game thus far. They tend to perform very, very well. Of course, they don't have the highest armour values next to sort of more similar mainline infantry units, but they will still perform very, very well. The high skill of the elves stands them in good stead a lot of the time, particularly against very low tier militia units. They hack through them very quickly. We've got a unit back here of Eldarenway swordsmen, so this is, I think, the first time I've seen them in a 1v1 situation thus far. They do cost, I think, 1,000 florins, so they are quite expensive, and generally speaking, they are going to be, again, the target of being focused down, similar to the Imladris pikemen at the front. However, once again, if they can get into melee, the dwarves will struggle to shut these guys down, short of occupying them with a very elite unit. But we'll get on to what Erebor have in a moment. We'll see what they have to counter this. Again, we can see that he's opted for quite a strange formation, a very long line of infantry, so potentially this is going to be the Imladris elves trying to overlap the dwarves, which is not a bad idea. He's also got the Imladris Guardians here, again, these higher tier option to the Eldar Makar. And obviously, you know, Mythlon Nobles, they're technically the sort of mid-tier option for the elves, but obviously they are in practice much better than mid-tier units. They're closer to higher tier units that other factions may have. And you have here the Imladris Blade Masters. Now, it's worth mentioning that they are not AP, despite the fact they have very long and impressive swords, but they do have a bonus versus cavalry, so if Erebor have brought their goats, or if they brought any of their mercenaries, getting a rear charge into the Imladris lines with all of these pikes and blade masters around might be more risky than it otherwise would be. So yeah, I do like the Imladris blade masters. That bonus versus cavalry can really help them in a pitched battle scenario like we're in now. And over here we have some Elven Cavalry. Now the High Elves, similar to all of the other 3 factions of elves, do not have any dedicated melee cavalry as such. It's all lancers basically. And the Eldarenway Lancers over here, they are shielded, however, so they will be more able to absorb more archer fire than quite a lot of other cavalry units. Obviously, they've got some decent armour as well on the Eldarenway Lancers. The High Elven Cavalry in general tends to be the most durable of the various Elven factions. The Linden Javelins do mix that up a little bit if the elves were to come together in a cavalry clash. But over here with the Eregian Cavalry, they have arguably the strongest single cavalry unit of the elves. I think, you know, again, the Noldorin Horse Lords and the Eregian Cavalry are quite close to one another in terms of quality, so it might be interesting to see which one of them wins out in a 1-to-1 situation. Probably the Eregian Cavalry because of the superior numbers per unit, but again, the High Elven Cavalry is going to be able to do a lot of damage off the charge over here. So we've got Eregian Cavalry and Eldarenway Lancers. They've also got some more on the other side, which we will get onto in a moment. He has got a small arch contingent of a couple of units of Elder Quinga. Now, it is important still, even if you're going very infantry heavy like Imladris are here, I think, to have some arch units, because while a lot of the Dwarven army is going to be very resilient to archers, there are still going to be individual targets within the Dwarven line which you can potentially target. Particularly something like the Ironfoot Pikes. They may well be heavily armoured, but the lack of a shield will hurt them over the course of a long game, and if you've only got a smaller archer force, the Dwarven player is much more likely to give it a lower priority. Obviously, if he has cavalry, he will probably still try and charge them, but he's much more likely to try and shut down your infantry, so over the course of a long battle, a couple of units of Elder Quinga could well do quite a lot of damage as we sort of scoot along. To the other side of the pikes, we've got another unit of Imladris Guardians and another unit of Imladris Blade Masters, so he's got a very even line. And then over here we shall have a look at more cavalry units. So over here we've got some Imladris Sentinels, previously of course called the Imladris Cavalry. Again, very similar in many ways to the Eldarenway Lancers, only they have a little bit more of a deficit in terms of stats, and of course they don't have a shield, so they are going to be a little bit more vulnerable to missile fire. But again, similar situation here. All of the High Elven Cav is focused around its very high charge damage. He's got another unit of the Imladris Sentinels over here. So he has put quite a lot of stock in his cavalry. He's got both units of the more expensive variety, and then even the Imladris Sentinels I think are 1,000 apiece, so he's invested heavily in his cavalry wing, so he's going to need to get some charges off to deal with that. Meanwhile, if we go over here to the Dwarves of Erebor, he's playing against Celtic, and as we have a look, he has got quite a lot of cavalry as well, so this is going to be, you know, he has got enough cavalry to give the elves quite a bit of trouble. You know, Crimson Bahili is going to have to micro his cav well to get in behind and get the charges he needs to make all of that cavalry worth it. So he does have some mercenary cavalry. They are of course melee cavalry. I think as well, based on the unit model, they've got the armor upgrade. So that will be very useful for warding off any of the archer fire should that be coming their way. They are melee cavalry as well, so they should do quite well, particularly against the Imladris Sentinels, or sentries maybe. I think the Sentinels are the pikes, they'll do horrible. Yes, Sentinels. So yeah, against the sentries, the pikes, they'll obviously do horribly. But if they can catch the High Elven Cav in melee, they should trade quite effectively. They won't necessarily win convincingly, but they will trade efficiently, and that's what the dwarves need to be able to do to that High Elven Cav. Over here, however, he's got the Ironfoot Hammerguard and the Ironfoot War Goats. Now, I know that the goats are a point of a little bit of contention among people who are big fans of the Tolkien lore. However, the Ironfoot Hammerguard, there is no doubting their effectiveness. They have a lot of mass to them. They are quite slow, but they are also a potentially devastating force on the field. They need to stay away from the pikes, but if they can get some nice charges of their own off, what the High Elves hope to inflict on the Dwarves will be able to inflict on the High Elves. And over here we've got the Ironfoot War Goats as well. I don't know whether these guys are spear cavalry or lancers. My bet would be on spears, which is kind of a sort of halfway house between lancers and melee cav. But yeah, obviously in sustained melee as well, they have a malus because spears have a malus. I think that's how it works. But again, I'm not sure if they are lancers or spear cav. But again, they do suffer the same problem as the Ironfoot Hammerguard. They are slower than regular cav units, so the dwarves will struggle to use their cav defensively against the elves if the elves manage to sort of buzz the dwarven lines effectively. Meanwhile, back here we've got one unit all on its lonesome, way back over here, and it is another unit of mercenary cavalry. They will be able to close the gap pretty quickly though, so it won't be too much of a problem. And over here we have some Axemen of Erebor, a unit which potentially the elves could go after with their 2 units of archers. Again, AP, so the AP damage will affect Imladris more so than the other 3 elven factions. But even so, I do think that the elves, in terms of how much skill they have, 1-to-1 will do quite well against a unit like this, but it's the numbers of the dwarves which may well start to overrun the High Elven lines. And over here we have some Ironfoot Halberds backing them up as a very nice sort of anchor to this wing of the attack. And another unit which could potentially be focused down by the archers, but again, there's only 2 units of archers, there's only so much they can focus down. Meanwhile, over here we've got Ironfoot Warriors behind a lot of Ironfoot Spears, and as we sort of go down this line here, you can see that this is the centre of Celtic's army, and the Spear and Ironfoot Warrior combination is an effective one. The mass of the Spears is going to mean they can push through the Imladris Pikes potentially, and then the Warriors can sort of reinforce their position because they will take losses doing that. But yeah, it's going to be a difficult centre for the High Elves to break down. They might have the quality to hack through them, but it's a lot of Ironfoot here, and with the Warriors just behind, it's going to be difficult to get through all of them. Another unit of Halberds over here, again, sort of following in behind the Spears and Warriors, may be able to shore up part of the line when it starts to flag a little bit, which it will in places because the Imladris infantry is very good. And back here we have the Blacklock Engineers. I've not seen these guys in action just yet. In the previous patch, they were a bit lackluster simply because they were technically more damaging than normal crossbows, but normal crossbows had so much more ammunition than them that the amount of damage you could deal out across a battle of with the Blacklock Engineers was a little bit lacking next to just basic crossbows, and they were very expensive. But I'd be interested to see how they do now. They could be very effective at dealing with the High Elven Cavalry again. So it's going to be difficult for Crimson to use all of this cavalry effectively with all of these troops on the field. And again, on this side we've got some more axemen and some more Ironfoot halberds. So it'll be interesting to see who makes the first move. I mean, Celtic is very quickly moving forward, which is, again, against the elves, I do think this is the way to go, simply because a lot of the elven skirmishes are very deadly. But even in this situation, the elves do have the ranged advantage. So you can see here the Elder Quinga firing into the unshielded infantry on this flank. So they will get some decent damage done there. But immediately the High Elven archers are going to be retreating. And while if we look way over here, there's already a cavalry engagement that's going to go down. So the mercenary cavalry is going in. The Elven Cav will be able to get a charge off, however, but the Imladra Sentinels need to be really careful around the Hammer Guard, because the Hammer Guard will probably just bowl right through them. And the Imladra Sentinels need to cycle charge in and out of the High Elven Cav. Meanwhile, if we go back over to the other side, we can see that already the Eregian Heavy Cavalry and the Eldarenway Lancers charging into the Axemen of Erebor, doing a huge amount of damage, following up from the initial attack that the archers launched on this wing. They do need to be careful of the Blacklock Engineers, but they are getting out of there, and the Mercenary Cavalry trying to chase them off. But a big wound inflicted on this flank of the Dwarven army. And they need to be careful because their centre won't win out in terms of quality, but I did notice over here that the Ironfoot Wargoats charged into the Imladris Blade Masters. Now that's an interesting choice. They need to get out of there because they're taking archer fire and they are unshielded, and while off the charge, the Wargoats will do quite nicely against a unit like this. When in sustained melee, the anti-cavalry bonus of the Blade Masters will kick in, and they managed to get some nice kills there. The Imladris Sentinels pulling back from the Ironfoot Hammer Guard. The Hammer Guard are going to be a real problem for the elves to deal with because they don't really have anything other than their pikes that could deal with them quickly. I mean, I think what they're going to have to do is just try and cycle charge them with the Imladris Sentinels and hope to wear them down over the course of the battle. Meanwhile, here in the middle, you can see that the Imladris Sentinels holding back all on their lonesome these Ironfoot Spears. Now again, if your micro is really very good indeed, you could be able to micro your cavalry and try and push through the pikes with your spears and shield wall. But all of that is very difficult to accomplish in a battle, of course, and the elves have certainly got the speed advantage over the dwarves. The Eldar Makar are now coming in as well to shore up the line. The Elder Quinga getting into position in behind the elves' front line. The halberds are now running up to try and support. The Imladris Guardians are doing a very good job against these basic Ironfoot spears and warriors. I think actually we will just slow things down to sort of get a nice perspective of what's going on. Where did the Elven Cav go? Okay, so the Elven Cav, the Eregian Cavalry and the Imladris Lancers, or the Eldarenway Lancers I should say, have gone out to the side. That's a lot of death that occurred over here. I mean, also if you look here, it looks like the Mercenary Cavalry pursued the High Elven Cavalry and went through the stakes. That's very bad news for Celtic, because all of this melee cavalry, if he managed to combine it with the Ironfoot Hammer Guard, he would certainly have been able to finish off the Imladris Sentinels, and the High Elven Cavalry would be much less of a threat to him. And he certainly needs to turn this into a battle of attrition, I think, the Dwarven player, because in terms of individual units of quality, the Dwarven line might be in danger of breaking in certain places. Over here, though, looks like some rear charges are going to be happening with the Ironfoot Wargoats. Over here, the Axemen of Erebor are surrounded, but they are being supported by the halberds. And if these Wargoats manage to cycle charge, particularly against these higher damage Imladris Blade Masters, the dwarves could be in a good place over on this flank at the very least. And then if they can sort of start squeezing in on the High Elven Cavalry and start getting some cycle charges onto this all-important main engagement, because this is where the vast majority of the dwarves are tied up at the moment. If we go back up to 1 speed, you can see the Imladris Sentries are a very, very effective pike unit, of course. In the past, they always have been, when they were called the Imladris Guards. The Ironfoot Hammer Guards still haven't taken a single loss, I don't think. I assume they're AP in melee as well, based on the fact they use Warhammers. But none of the High Elven Cavalry is particularly well placed to deal with this. They don't have any melee cav, they don't have any armor-piercing missiles in their army either. So they're trying to sort of whittle down the Ironfoot Hammer Guard. They're even committing their Eregian Cavalry now, but with the damage they took from the Blacklocks earlier on, I don't think they're going to have the staying power to do much there. These halberds are not fully committed into the fight, but now they are moving forwards. Very wide lines, so they're going to be able to support all of these units. But the Imladris Guardians holding very well. And again, the Imladris Guardians are quite expensive, particularly next to the much more affordable Ironfoot, and you do get what you pay for, so the Imladris Guardians are able to hold back this enormous line, but with the support of the halberds, I do think that the Imladris Guardians will start to feel the pinch, and indeed they are. defeat is looking certain. So on the flanks, the Dwarves are doing really very well. The Imladris Blade Masters, there simply isn't enough of them to deal with the Ironfoot. And there is another unit of Halberds back there. The Blacklock Engineers, you can see their projectiles look a little different, and they're going after the High Elven Cavalry. In the middle, though, the Eldarenway Swordsmen have been sent into the front line, and in the middle, the High Elves are winning. Well, Imladris, I should say. The Ironfoot Wargoats getting a nice rear charge into the Eldarenway Swordsmen, who do not have an anti-cavalry bonus, I believe. But this is risky, because if the pikes were to turn around, this unit of Wargoats would very quickly find itself dying off. These Hammer Guard, they have taken some losses now, so after taking some charges from the Eregian Cavalry and the Eldarenway Lancers. But over here, the High Elven Archers, one of their units of archers has been sort of singled out by the goats, whereas this one unit of Quinga, if I was the Dwarves, to be honest with you, I wouldn't bother chasing the High Elven Cavalry. I would certainly try and start really rear-charging the front line, because the Elves would really struggle in terms of numbers. The Wargoats, the Ironfoot Hammer Guard, I should say, have got a lethal charge, and it's only really the pikes that would be able to damage them in melee, and they're sort of towards the front of the line. You'd be able to basically break these Imladris Guardians with a charge from the Ironfoot Hammer Guard. And this is exactly what the Elves need to do. Sort of baiting the goats away from the danger area. And the Eregian Cavalry sort of cycle charging. They're able to sort of charge in and then run away quickly before the Hammer Guard gets a huge amount of damage done. There's also these Elven Missiles still alive. This is a very wide engagement, which you would think would favour the Dwarves, and in places it has. But here in the middle, where the Elves are sort of more stacked with their pikes and their Eldarenway, things have certainly gone against the Dwarves. Although over here they still have a lot of Ironfoot. I mean, it is a lot of Dwarves that the Elves from Imladris are having to carve their way through here. And there is still quite a long way to go in this battle. Over here, the engagement has kind of... It looked like it was going to go pretty heavily in the Dwarves' favour if the Wargoats continued their cycle charging, but now the Imladris Guardians are able to hold against these Halberds and these Axemen. I do think the Dwarves will still have a narrow victory over here, but nothing that's going to overly impact the battle as a whole now, which is a bit of a shame for them, because if the Dwarves... The fate of the Dwarves is really going to rest on whether or not they can get in behind the Elves here. And if you look over here, the Elves are down by 5%, but I do think that the quality of the Elves is going to kick in a little while. If you have a look back here, the Hammer Guard is actually now starting to lose out, and now with the Eregian Cavalry, the High Elves suddenly have the impetus to get in behind the Dwarven lines and start charging away, and the Dwarves don't have the same level of morale as the Elves, and particularly with these lower tier Ironfoots, I mean, I'm calling them lower tier, but it's only in comparison with the Elves, of course. But some rear charges are certainly not what the Dwarves need, because it would start to break their front line. And over here even, the Imladris Guardians still holding on. They've performed really very well against this flood of Ironfoot halberds, spears and warriors. But it is on this flank where the Dwarves are having the most success. 2 units of halberds came over here, and again the Imladris Blade Masters over here were just kind of overwhelmed. They also have the Axemen of Erebor. While they did take those early charges, they have now managed to get into melee, and they are making a difference. That AP damage is going to do some damage to the Imladris Blade Masters. An armor score of 12 on those guys, which is not insubstantial. It's one of the... it's a heavily armoured value, that is. Meanwhile, the Ironfoot Hammer Guard is now being chased down. The Dwarven General being sent packing by Elrond. Don't know what Dane's going to do. I mean, this is the problem. If you're trying to sort of get your Hammer Guard away from the High Elven Cav, it's just not going to happen, because the goats are so much slower than the swift Elven steeds. Meanwhile, over here, the Imladris Sentries still doing a real stellar job here in the middle. The Elven Pikes really holding the middle down. And even though their damage is not going to be too effective against armoured targets, over the course of a long battle, the damage will add up. Ooh, and Dane running into the pikes. It's less of a pony and more of an oversized ram. But now you can see the breaking is starting, because the elves are going to be the ones that are going to be able to get into the Dwarven backline. It could have gone either way, this one, but I do think now the cascade is going to favour the Dwarves. I mean, over here the Dwarves are going to win. And they do have a fairly healthy amount of halberds and axemen of Erebor, but it's not going to be enough to patch over the cracks in this line. I mean, the spears, they're trying to reform, but this is really the problem now, because while the Eregian Cavalry and the Eldarenway Lancers are only a small unit now, with how the Dwarves are starting to break, it's more the fact that they're going to be able to send units routing than the damage they do. Meanwhile, the Blacklock Engineers, they are shaken. Definitely an expensive unit, this. And unfortunately, because this is from Crimson's perspective, I won't see how many kills they racked up over the battle, but certainly in terms of a cavalry repellent, it was definitely worth having them in the back lines. Because the High Elven Cavalry, it's only now managing to get in behind and charge the Dwarves. Earlier on, if they'd have tried that, the Black Blocks probably would have gunned them down pretty quickly. But over here is where the Dwarves are having the most success still. They've got a very large clump of troops, but now the Elder Quinga, still over the course of a long battle, those missiles, having them in the pocket in the late game. Particularly against the unshielded halberds, which the vast majority of this Dwarven infantry is. And you can see there is still some Blade Masters. So while the elves were pretty hopelessly outnumbered on the two flanks, and they did technically lose the infantry fight on the two flanks, the dwarves were not able to make them pay dearly enough, I don't think. And in the middle, the elven pikes were able to go to town on the basic dwarven ironfoots, and ultimately the goats were outmaneuvered by the elven cavalry. You know, the speed helped the elves, I think. The ability to cycle charge in and out of combat with the hammer guard, because in sustained melee, the Eregian Cavalry and the Eldorunwy Lancers, the AP on those Warhammers would really start to reap a bloody toll. Meanwhile, over here you can actually see that there are some Ironfoot Spears. They're probably going to try and go after the Elder Quinga to prevent them from shooting into their more vulnerable Ironfoot Halberds. In fact, they are getting into shield wall. I mean, Crimson is certainly not going to take the bait and shoot them point blank, shoot his arrows point blank into a heavily armoured and shielded unit. I mean, if you look over here, a lot of these pikes have fallen, so the dwarves have certainly left an impact on the High Elven line. But in a very wide and thin fight like this, it will often come down to who can get into the back lines of their opponent more effectively. And here in the late game, it's certainly going to be the elves. The Eregian Cavalry getting a nice charge, and there goes the routing. When the Anvil is a unit of high tier pikes, and the Hammer is a unit of very high tier Elven Lancers, you can't really blame the dwarves for routing. They do still have a decent amount of men left, but not enough of them are high tier enough to withstand the elves, I don't think. I mean, there are a lot of halberds, so the Cav is going to have some issues trying to charge in and be effective. And also, if you look over here, the Axemen of Erebor and the Ironfoot Spears trying to finish off the Elven Archers, which is a good move actually, because it will mean that the elves are not going to be able to sort of just shoot the Ironfoot Halberds, which at this point are the Dwarven player's best bet. I mean, the dwarves are still ahead on percentage. Some of that famous Dwarven resilience is starting to kick in, although really the only truly elite unit they have left are the Blackrock Engineers, and they are actually winning this fight over here against the Pikes. But they're going to need the support of the Halberds to make this fight cost effective, I think, because the Blackblocks are taking losses to the Imladris Pikemen. You can see over here a nice rear charge there. And again, I think if they get rid of the Blacklock Engineers, their melee powerhouse is going to disappear. Because again, the rear charges these cavalry are going to be able to produce are going to last into the late game. There are still some Imladris Sentinels in the background over there. And again, getting a rear charge onto sort of battle-weary halberds is still going to send them routing. It's only really when you attack them front on when they're in formation that cavalry really starts to lose out to halberdiers. And you can also see that there's more Imladris sentries, a much more healthy unit coming forth. The halberds sort of slowly ambling into the fight, but these Blackblocks taking another rear charge. I don't know, you know. The elves might be running low on men, because the dwarves did make them pay. And the elves, of course, can afford fewer casualties than everyone else. But regardless of what happened here, I do think that the elves were much better served trying to fight the dwarves in this manner than Mirkwood were in the previous fight, because the missile-heavy approach of Mirkwood, the armour of the dwarves really paid off for them there. Whereas here, Imladris are more geared for a fight like this, you know, particularly with the Imladris sentries here. You know, they were really the linchpin of the dwarven line, and they did a very good job. And it's something that Mirkwood don't have, but Mirkwood do have a lot of infantry options which are pretty damn good. I mean, if you look at the Hiri Lung, for example, it's a very cost-effective swordsman unit, which against the vast majority of these Ironfoot units would perform very well. There's the Eregian Cavalry. And I do believe that one of the Mirkwood units, which was an archer, has sort of been transitioned over to be more of a shock unit. And over here you can see that the Ironfoot Halberds routing. And I think morale is going to be the killer for the dwarves here. I mean, these Ironfoot Halberds are trying to chase... Actually, no, the Imladris sentries over here were killed. these Blacklocks, I think the Dwarves, they need to rally and sort of group up a little bit so that their morale doesn't fall apart, but I don't think the Dwarves have got an answer to these sentries at this point. The Imladris Pikes have been such an MVP of this match. They held down the centre so effectively. While the Eldarenway Swordsmen charging into the Halberds without the Pikemen's support. But again, the Eldarenway Swordsmen seem to have done quite well as well. Other than that rear charge they took from the Goats, they've held up reasonably well. We'll see how many kills they got by the end. That'll be the ultimate litmus test of them. Because I do think with how expensive they are and the fact you can only have one, they are a risky choice, particularly in a field battle. I'd be much more tempted to go for the Blade Masters, particularly with that anti-cavalry trait they have. Eldar Quinga moving away, the Ironfoot Spears, so the elves avoiding an engagement with these Ironfoot Spears, but a lot of the Dwarven troops are now becoming shaken. Those Blacklock Engineers actually able to get a rear charge onto the Imladris sentries. Victory seems certain. The Blacklock Engineers in melee have proven themselves to be quite a powerhouse. They are very expensive though, so again, a unit this expensive is going to become more of a target for the enemy, but the risks that the elves have taken seem to have paid off here. The fact that quite a lot of the elven troops were honestly quite weak to ranged fire.
Let's pray it remains as such.
Trying to think of what unit the dwarves could have brought to make life more difficult for the elves, and I think perhaps the mounted crossbows could have been a pretty good choice. You know, the early charge that the elves managed on those Axemen of Erebor certainly didn't help, but I don't think that more Axemen of let's say that they had half a unit of Axemen of Erebor here in the late game. I'm not sure that would be enough to turn the battle around. It might be, actually. If you look over here, there are still... these halberds are routing off. But there's a pretty hefty contingent of spears over here, which the cavalry's not going to be too thrilled about. These Ironfoot warriors are breaking, though. The Elder Quinga are moving away. And again, the elves do still have those missiles, which... it's not going to do horrendous damage, but... over the course of the battle, I'm sure that the Elder Quinga have racked up a decent number of kills, considering that they're up against heavily armoured and heavily shielded foes, and the combination of the Eldarenway Swordsmen and Imladris sentries over here has put the Blacklock Engineers to the sword, and they are now routing off as well, so yeah. The elves able to stand. And the Elven morale held together as well, considering that their line was looking very thin in certain places. These Ironfoot Spears marching forth. Yeah, it's going to be a victory for the elves here. Even with the spears, they could try and push into the sentries, but they're not going to be a match for the Eldarenway Swordsmen, and they don't have the halberds anymore to really ward off the cavalry, so cycle charging and shooting from a distance is going to be a problem, and the Elder Quinga have returned. Come into my parlour, said the spider to the fly. Not the best charge there, but that is enough to send the Ironfoot warriors routing. The Ironfoot Spears are shaken, and I can't imagine they're going to stick around too long in this fight. Defeat seems certain.
The battle is very much in our favour.
There's one Imladris Sentinel just running around the field. They are wavering, being shot in the back. They're going to break. Actually, no, they're just shaken. The morale is somewhat stabilising, amazingly enough, as the elves continue to fire in with their archers. Those Ironfoot warriors are routing back towards the fight. You'd think if you were running for your lives, you wouldn't run towards the Elven pikemen. You can see that even with rear shots, those Elder Quinga are not getting a huge amount of kills on the heavily armoured Ironfoot Spears, but ultimately it is going to be the morale which finally ends the hopes of the Dwarves. But that was a very good match as well, very close.
By the victory we have won here today.
As you can see, it was within 6% of one another, which is impressively close. Of course, it's not 100% to 100% because of the routing units that fled the field. But yes, the elves had a significantly smaller army than the dwarves, which is what I think you can expect. The dwarves can go more quality heavy, but I don't think it behooves them to do that against the elves. I think that they would be much more likely to do that against someone like, you know, the various kingdoms of men, in particular the evil men, who focus a little bit more around swarming tactics, stuff like, you know, armies like Rudawa. But in this situation, I think that Crimson, played it very well. I think that the slight risk with what he did was his line was quite thin, and I think that if the spears put themselves into shield wall and pushed through the lines in certain places, the elves would have been in significantly more trouble. And he also lost those Axemen of Erebor quite early, of course, with that pretty nasty charge. But yeah, I mean, potentially the Ironfoot crossbows, not the Ironfoot crossbows, the mounted mercenary crossbows could have helped, but I don't think the composition from Celtic was all that wrong, to be honest with you. It wouldn't have taken too much for this battle to go the other way, I think. But yeah, let's have a look at the kills. Let's see how the Imladris army performed. Decent amount of kills on the Elven Cavalry, 134. They lasted into the late game. Did surprisingly well against the Hammer Guard. They were cycle charging, of course, so you do need to be careful around the Hammer Guard. You're going to need to micro your cavalry very well. Other than that, the other units of cavalry not getting too many kills, but they did manage to shut down the Dwarven Goats, which did save the Elven front line. So a lot of kills on those Elder Enway swordsmen, 213, mostly Ironfoots, but even so, very nicely performed considering they lost quite a lot of men from that one charge. Decent amount of kills on the Blade Masters. This other one, I think it was the one that got charged by those goats, so only got 51. The Imladris Guardians performed very well on both flanks as well, managing to hold back the tide just long enough. One unit of Imladris Sentries getting 256 kills. That's a very nice return on heavily armoured Dwarven infantry. And the Elder Quinga, you know, neither one of them breaking 100 kills, but the damage they did over the course of the battle certainly piled up, particularly onto the flank where the Dwarves were winning, I think, against the Halberdiers. The damage that they did start to tell towards the late game, so definitely a worthwhile investment to bring some archers, but just not overdoing it, because then the Dwarves, of course, any less infantry units, and the Dwarves would probably have overrun the front line. Only really the Eldar Makar was surplus to requirements there, because they were committed alongside the Pikes, and the Pikes and the Elder Enway managed to hold just fine on their own. So yeah, very well performed. So this time, the Elves having the best of the Dwarves, and I do think that if you're going to face the Dwarves as the Elves, this is more the way to do it, because the Dwarves are going to be aggressive. In fact, quite a lot of people are probably going to be aggressive against the Elves simply because Elven skirmishes are so lethal. So as the Elves, it does behoove you to not go hugely skirmisher heavy, I think, because I think people will very quickly get wise to that and start to rush the Elves down, which the Dwarves did do. Celtic was very aggressive here, but Crimson was ready for him in this case. The Elven infantry, the quality was there to hold the line, and ultimately, in the end, the Elves were the ones able to circumvent the Dwarven lines. So yeah, very nice match. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.